This is the last of some of my older content. Unfortunately, I lost most of my footage from October and the beginning of November as it was accidentally deleted, but hopefully this means that my hand makes less frequent appearances in the future. This video is from a 5-5 session at 101 Poker. We play almost all of these hands exclusively out of position, so hopefully we can use aggression to nullify some of that positional disadvantage. Enjoy! We start off this session with a $10 straddle. It folds around to the button, who is a slightly aggressive reg. He opens to 40, an aggressive regular in the small blind, flats, and it gets to me. I think that my hand can play either as a call or a 3-bet. I think that it plays relatively well multi-way, being suited and connected with two stronger cards. I do think that versus this reg's open on the button, I can have a linear 3-betting range and use Queen 10 as a value hand. I also think that the aggressive reg in the small blind is going to have a weaker range because I expect him to be 3-betting often, especially with his stronger hands. I decide to bump it up to 220, and the reg on the button thinks for a little bit and he makes it 550. It folds to me. I think I have a pretty clear continue here versus a 4-bet. I don't love it, but I think that my suited broadways and my pocket pairs mostly have to continue. I do make the call. We go to a flop with the pot at $1,145. The flop is the beautiful Queen of Hearts, 10 of Hearts, 5 of Diamonds. Loving life, flopping top 2 pair here in a 4-bet pot. I check to the aggressor. He thinks for a little bit and he checks behind. I think when he checks back that he's likely to have pocket pairs that are under the queen or the 10. So hands like pocket jacks, possibly pocket 9s. I'm not sure exactly how wide he's 4-betting with his pocket pairs. I think it's pretty reasonable for him to have a hand like ace king, ace jack as well, although I would expect those to be betting at some frequency. I also expect him to be mostly betting his pocket aces, pocket kings, ace queen, hands like that, but I do expect him to check them back at a low frequency. The turn is the 4 of clubs, which doesn't really change much. I think that I can bet multiple sizes here on the turn. I typically think that I want to be leading here out of position. I can use a size of around 33% to 60%. I think with the stack to pot ratio and being a 4-bet pot, I'm going to size down here. I can easily get the money in on the river. I bet 400 into 1145 and he makes the call. At this point, I think he still has some ace king, some ace jack. He could have hands like ace 10 as well, or pocket jacks, pocket 9s that are going to call once. I don't expect him to have too many heart draws at this point, but it's definitely possible. He could also have a hand like king queen, queen jack, which is a little bit weaker of a top pair, and he's trying to pot control. The river is the 8 of diamonds, which doesn't really change much. I think I have a pretty clear shove here for just over half pot. Think for a little bit, and I do make the shove, and he quickly folds. And we scoop a pretty good sized pot to start the session. In this hand, we have a straddle by a middle-aged gentleman who I've never played with before. It folds around to the small blind, who is a tighter middle-aged player. He opens up to 25, which is a very small size considering the straddle is $10. I think that I do want to continue here versus this size. I don't think I necessarily want to be 3-betting too much with these weaker suited connected hands against this player, as he's going to be opening a slightly tighter range. So I do make the call, and the straddle also makes the call. We go to the flop with a pot of $75, and the flop is the queen of spades, 4 of spades, 2 of hearts. Pretty beautiful flop for our hand with the flush draw and the straight draw, as well as 2 overs to the 4. It checks to me. I think I have multiple options here. My general strategy playing in the blinds out of position is to be mostly checking my hand, and if I choose to play aggressively, be playing it as a check raise. Ranges are so wide here and I'm out of position, so I generally just want to be pot controlling at a high frequency. Obviously, multi-way, this changes the dynamics quite a bit. So I think that my hand in this spot can either bet small or check. I decide to make the check here, and the straddle thinks for a little bit, and he bets 55 into 75. The small blind quickly folds and it gets to me. I think that my hand can play either as a call or a raise in this spot. Although I have 6 high, my hand has a ton of equity here, so I think that a call is reasonable. And the urgency is also relatively low. I have multiple other streets that I can attempt to gain value or bluff my opponent. But I think that overall the 6-5 of spades is going to be wanting to raise a little higher frequency than many of my other draws, as even though I have a lot of equity, overall my hand is relatively frail, being just 6 high here, and getting any fold equity is going to be a massive advantage to my hand. I do decide to make the raise and I bump it up to $220. The straddle player thinks for a little bit and says that he doesn't want to get involved in this pot. He shows queen 7 of clubs and makes the fold. So definitely a fine result for me. I mean, like I said, I have a decent amount of equity here, but getting a fold is always going to be profitable, especially when I don't have a made hand yet. We have another straddle pot in this hand. The aggressive regular from earlier opens up on the button to $30. It gets to me in the big blind. I should probably be folding this hand at a pretty high frequency. I don't really want to be playing out of position too often, but I do think that multi-way this hand plays okay, and the player in the straddle has not been very aggressive. He's the same player that folded the queen of clubs, 7 of clubs on the previous hand, so I expect to see a flop pretty frequently here. The button sizing is also pretty small for a live setting, so I think I can call at a little bit higher frequency than normal. I do make the call and the straddle player makes the call as well. We go to the flop with a pot of $95, and the flop is the king of spades, 7 of clubs, 4 of diamonds. It checks to the button and he bets 55 into 95. I think that typically I want to be probably folding this hand. It's a relatively dry board, so I think I do need to continue with some of my 7x, but I think that generally I'd prefer to have a backdoor, so either 7x of spades or 7x of diamonds. I'd also prefer to continue with a hand like 7-6, 7-5 that has the backdoor straight draw. In this specific scenario, I could tell that the straddle player was going to make the fold, and with the button being a pretty aggressive player, I think I want to continue at a higher frequency. So I'd elect to make the call here, and the straddle quickly folds. The pot is $205, and we go to the turn with the ace of clubs. I check to the button, and he elects to bet 120 into 205. A little bit on the smaller side. I think generally that my hand is going to probably be a very high frequency fold here, but my hand does have some good properties in the sense that I'm not blocking any of his bluffs here. So I don't block any of the hands like Queen Jack, Jack 10 that might continue here. I don't block a hand like 6-5 that might continue here. I also don't have clubs, which he might continue here. It's kind of a weird spot for him to bet here, as I don't think that my opponent has too much ace-x here. Although he is on the aggressive side, I would expect him to generally be checking back a lot of his ace-x on the flop, as we are multi-way. If he did continue with an ace here, I would expect it to be mostly ace-x with backdoor draws, or possibly something like ace-queen where it has 2 stronger overcards. But overall, his bet doesn't make too much sense to me. It's on the smaller side, and I know that he is a very aggressive player. So I decide to make the call here. We go to a river with the pot at $445. The river is the beautiful 7 of diamonds. So we hit the miracle trips on the river. We check and the button continues here with the triple barrel for 270 into 445. Right now, pretty much 11 life. Although I think that my opponent does have a decent amount of draws that missed here, I'm now ahead of the vast majority of his value. He could have hands like 2 pair, ace king, ace 7, ace 4 that elected to bet on the flop. He also has that small frequency of ace x hands that made it to the turn and were bluffing but then became value bets. Hands like ace queen, ace jack, and weaker ace x that had the back doors. At this point, I would expect him to bet most of his ace x on the river, as it's very hard for me to have an ace with a player behind on the flop. I think that I'm heavily weighted towards king x hands, so he has a clear value bet with his top pair. I do decide to make the raise to $900, hoping to get called by one of his ace x combos. I think that it's pretty hard for me to have a lot of value hands here. It's mostly going to be full houses like pocket fours, king 7, ace 7, and 7-4 that I decided not to raise on the flop or the turn. I don't really have too much naked 7x in my range, as most of the weaker pairs that I would be continuing with on the turn are going to be clubs, and the 7 of clubs is out there. I think I can definitely have some bluffs here, as multiple straight draws missed and a few flush draws that I would have got to on the turn would have missed. The button thinks for a little bit and ultimately he does make the call. We show the 9-7 and we scoop a $2,245 pot. In this hand we have a straddle to $25 because there are no rules in Texas. It folds to the cutoff, who is the aggressive regular from earlier. He opens to $75, and I decide to 3-bet to $300 with ace of spades, queen of spades. And once again, we are battling against the aggressive reg. This will end up being a theme throughout the rest of the session. It folds to the aggressive reg, and he makes the call. We have a pot of $630 and we go to a flop with the jack of hearts, 7 of clubs, 5 of spades. I think that my hand is primarily going to be checking here, but it is definitely reasonable to bet at some frequency with the overcards, the backdoor straight and the backdoor flush. On this board, I can use either sizing, a small sizing of around 33% pot or a larger sizing around 60% pot. Primarily, I'm going to be using the B60 on this board if I elect to c-bet. In this situation, I do decide to check with the plan of calling versus a float bet, but the aggressive reg checks behind. The turn is the 8 of clubs. At this point, I just want to reach showdown. I think that my ace high is good at a pretty high frequency, as my opponent has worse ace high and Broadway hands like king, queen, queen 10. I check again and the aggressive reg thinks for a little bit and he checks behind. The river is the 7 of hearts and I'm going to continue to check, trying to reach showdown. Unfortunately, the aggressive reg thinks for a little bit and he bets 600 into 630. When he bets this size, he is very polarized to a massive hand or a bluff. I think that this player is fully capable of bluffing with the Broadway hands and possibly worse ace-x, all of which I'm beating. His value hands are mostly going to be made up of 7x here and some full houses. I think that it's difficult for him to have a 7 here at any high frequency, as I block ace 7 suited, and I think that when he opens cutoff and calls a 3-bet, most of his other 7x is going to be either 8-7 or 7-6 suited. I would expect him to be betting his 8-7, which turned to pair at a pretty high frequency on the turn. And although I think he can mix with 7-6, I would also expect him to be betting 7-6 at a pretty high frequency when he turns the open ender on the turn. Regardless, he only has 2 combos of 8-7 suited, 2 combos of 7-6 suited, and 1 combo of Ace-7 suited from my perspective. And when we don't think that all of those hands will play that way, those are further reduced. You could also have a small frequency of hands like pocket 5s, pocket 8s, although I expect those to be betting a very high frequency on the flop and or the turn. When he uses this sizing, I do not expect him to have a hand like Jack X. So overall, I think that there are a lot of bluffs in his range. I also do not think that he has a hand like 10-9, as I think he would be betting this a very high frequency on the flop and the turn, even more so than his 7x combos. And if we think all of his bluffing range is going to be the broadways and worse ace-x hands, then my ace-queen is ahead of all of those bluffs. So I think I actually do have a reasonable bluff catcher at this point, even though I only have ace-high. I tank for a few minutes and ultimately decide to make the hero call. Unfortunately, my opponent shows me the ace-7 of diamonds, which was one of the very few hands that does make sense, and he scoops this $1,800 pot. About an orbit later, we have a very similar preflop situation as the last hand. We have a straddle to $10. It folds around to the low jack, where an older gentleman limps, and then it folds to the aggressive reg from earlier. He bumps it up to $55, and it folds to me. I think that this is going to be a pretty pure 3-bet versus the cutoff open that is playing on the aggressive side. I don't want to be playing this hand out of position or multi-way. I raise it up to 120. This was just a sizing mistake by me. I meant to raise to 220. Unfortunately, I make a few sizing errors throughout this session, just miscounting slightly. Regardless, I don't think it has a major impact in the rest of this hand. It folds back to the aggressive regular in the cutoff, and he makes the call. We go to a flop with the pot at $265. The flop is the King of Hearts, 4 of Spades, 2 of Spades. Unlike the Jack High flop from the previous hand, I think that the King High low boards are going to be much more favorable to me, and I'm going to be continuing here at a very high frequency in a 3-bet pot. Generally, I'm going to elect to use smaller sizes on these type of boards, as although I do have a nut advantage with hands like Ace-King, I think that the King X is going to hit my opponent's range a little bit harder with the King-Queen, King-Jack, King-10 portion of their range. I also have a lot of hands like pocket queens, pocket jacks, pocket 10s that do not love this king high board, and they will still be betting a high frequency due to my range advantage, but it definitely diminishes my overall nut advantage quite a bit. I do elect to c-bet here, and I bet $80 into 265, and the cutoff player makes the call. The pot is $425, and we go to a turn with the 5 of Spades, giving me the nut flush draw and the straight flush draw. I think that my hand can really take any action, but generally I'm going to elect to bet here at a very high frequency with the Ace of Spades. I also block the top of my opponent's calling range with the Queen of Clubs. I continue here for 245, and my opponent thinks for a little bit, and they make the call. I think that when my opponent makes the call here, that a large portion of their range is going to be King X and pocket pairs that contain a spade, so hands like pocket 9s, pocket 8s, pocket 7s. I think that his weaker pocket pairs, even pocket 6s, can't really make this call at a very high frequency without the spade. If my opponent has the King of Spades, I also think that it's a pretty easy call for them. I don't expect my opponent to be raising here very often. They definitely have some flushes here, but I block all of the strongest ones. Overall, when my opponent does make the call here, I think that he is pretty capped, as I don't think that he has too many combos of sets. And like we said, the spade combos are minimized quite a bit when I have the Ace of Spades. The river is the 4 of diamonds, which should not really improve my opponent's range at a high frequency. I think that I have a pretty clear bluff here most of the time with the ace of spades, and again blocking the stronger top pair combos that my opponent has and facing a pretty capped range. I think versus a capped range where I have a strong nut advantage still, I want to be using massive sizes. I elect to continue here with a overbet of 1200 into the pot of just over 900. My opponent tanks for a little bit and they lay it down. We once again have a straddle in this hand. I open ace of spades, 6 of spades from early position. It folds around to the button, who is a loose regular who often buys in really deep. He 3-bets to 130. Facing a 3-bet, I think that my hand is generally just going to be a fold here. This is one of the weaker hands I'm going to have in early position, and specifically this combo of ace-x suited cannot make a straight with both cards, and I'm often dominated. But when it folds to the straddle, he elects to make the call, and I think when the action is on me that I have a pretty good price, and with a suited ace, I think my hand plays relatively well multi-way, so I do make the call. The pot is $400 and we go to a flop of jack of diamonds, queen of hearts, 2 of spades. Pretty much a complete whiff with my hand, and at this point I'm pretty much just going to be check folding. The straddle checks, I check, and the loose reg quickly checks back. I expect this loose reg to be betting a very high frequency of his overpairs and his strong queen X. I think that he is on the aggressive side, and I would expect him to be c-betting a high frequency with bluffs and his stronger hands overall. So I think that when he checks here, I expect him to have Jack X combos and pocket pairs under the Jack X a high frequency, or just have complete air, like possibly a suited ace X or 8-7 suited, something like that. I would expect most of his straight draws to be continuing here. The turn is the queen of diamonds. It checks to me again. I think generally my hand is probably going to be a pure check, but I think when it checks around to me, I expect the loose reg and the tighter gentleman in the straddle to both have hands that are not very strong on this board. I think that my overall range connects here pretty strong. I think I do have a decent amount of queen X here. I think that I can value bet my jack X here, and I probably have a very low frequency of pocket twos that neither other player has. So I think I have a pretty substantial range advantage, and I'm going to be checking and pot controlling with a lot of my pocket pairs, but I do need to have some bluffs here. Although I would like to have some equity with a straight draw or a flush draw often, the ace of spades, 6 of spades also does not block any of the calling range here, and I can put another barrel in on the river. Again, I miscount slightly on this pot, and I was thinking it was slightly smaller. I would have probably sized up a little bit more with my bet size, but I think my sizing is fine here. I elect to bet 200 into 400, so about half pot. Again, I think I want to be a little bit more polarized here as I'm weighted towards primarily queen X plus and draws. The button thinks for a little bit and he makes the call. At this point, I think that the button's range is primarily going to be Jack X, and I think that he might call at some frequency with hands like pocket 10s through pocket 8s or 7s. I don't expect him to be playing a strong hand this way very often. The straddle makes the fold, and we go to the river with the pot at $800. The river is the 4 of clubs. I think at this point, unblocking diamonds, I want to be bluffing with a higher frequency with my hand. I'm also in a situation where I am pretty uncapped, and I think my opponent is relatively capped, as I don't think that they really have queen X or stronger. I also don't expect them to have too many overpairs here. I think generally I want to just be using a pretty large sizing here. I decide to bet 550 into the pot of 800. The reg thinks for quite a bit and ultimately makes the fold. The table was like, show the bluff, show the bluff. And ultimately I decide to show the ace 6 suited, which is probably not great. I was told that the loose reg had queen 10 suited that he decided to check the flop with and fold on the river, thinking that I didn't have very many bluffs here and that his kicker was pretty much never good against my value range. I find that hard to believe, but it's possible. Regardless, we scoop a pretty good sized pot here with a bluff that was a little bit out of line. We have another straddle pot. It folds around to the small blind, which is a tighter middle-aged gentleman. He limps. I look down at 10 of diamonds, 8 of diamonds in the big blind, and I bump it up to $50. The straddle makes the fold and the small blind makes the call. We go to a flop with the pot at $110. The flop is the king of hearts, 9 of diamonds, 4 of spades. The small blind checks here. I think that in position I want to be continuing with my hand at a high frequency on the king high boards. I think that my specific hand, although it does not have a draw, it has pretty good backdoors. I'm able to pick up a straight or pick up a flush. I'm also able to make a stronger pair than my opponent when a 10 hits at some frequency and a very small frequency of the time when an 8 hits. And because I think that I'm going to be betting this board at a high frequency, I do continue here. I continue for a size of $35 into 110. I think that I can be using a mix of sizes here. I don't really have a massive preference towards a small or large sizing. This is also kind of a somewhat weird situation where we are blind versus blind and I'm the aggressor in position. The small blind makes the call and we have a pot of $180. We go to the turn, and the turn is the jack of spades, giving me the open-ended straight draw. It checks to me, and I think that I want to continue here with my hand at a high frequency. I picked up equity, which was one of the main reasons I bet the flop, and my hand is pretty frail and has very little showdown value overall. I also blocked the nuts, which is queen 10 on this board. I think that overall I would be continuing here at a decent frequency. I think that I still have a lot of the stronger hands like strong king X. I think I've picked up 2 pair here on the turn, a decent amount. And I think that I can even continue here with some of my stronger jack X that bet the flop if I decided to bet a hand like ace jack. With the board getting wetter and it connecting a little bit stronger with my opponent's range and picking up equity with my 10 high, I think it's reasonable to mix in some overbets here. And I think that my specific combo is going to be overbetting at a little bit higher frequency. I don't think generally I will be using the overbet sizing, but I think versus a player that has been on the tighter side, I think I want to maximize my fold equity. So I do decide to have a small overbet here with a bet size of 220 into the pot of 180. My opponent thinks for a little bit and makes the call. I think at this point, my opponent often has a decent king X, probably something like king queen or king 10 that has the straight draw. I think that he has some 2 pair combos here, and I think that he will have some king X combos and 9X combos with a spade. I think that if my opponent had a hand like pocket 4s here, that he would have elected to probably raise already. Although I think some of his 2 pair combos are going to mix and he might be calling, with the stronger 2 pairs more likely to be raising. I think if he had a hand like queen 10, I think he would be raising a high frequency. People often see the flush draw here and they want to charge the draws, even though I think the flush draws in my range are going to be a lower frequency than if the flush draw was on the flop. We go to the river with a pot of $620, and we see the miraculous 7 of diamonds giving us the runner straight. My opponent checks to me. At this point, I think that I'm miles ahead of my opponent. I do not expect him to have queen 10 here. I think that my opponent has seen me overbet bluff a couple times throughout this session, and he knows that I'm definitely capable of making this bluff on the river. I think there's quite a few hands in my range that would have no showdown value on this river. Hands like ace queen, ace 10. I think I would have hands like 10-9 that, although it is a weak pair, it blocks the straight draw, so it doesn't have as much showdown value against this opponent as it normally would. And I think that I'm going to have some frequency of flush draws here and possibly just some air in general, although I'm much less likely to be betting air as a overbet on the turn. But we go back to the ace 6 of spades hand that we played previously, and my opponent knows that I could have complete air in spots occasionally. Overall, with my specific combo, I think that I am unblocking a lot of the value range that my opponent can have that would make the call here. So I think I primarily want to be using an overbet sizing. I bet 900 into the pot of 620. My opponent tanks for a while. He says that against any other opponent he would probably be making this fold, but ultimately he does call. I show the straight, and he shows the 9-7 of spades, which picked up the flush draw on the turn and rivered 2 pair. And we scoop this massive pot of $2,420. In this final hand of the session, I will once again be battling against the aggressive reg. Unfortunately, I start this hand off with a sizing mistake, as I thought that we were playing a straddle pot, which has been consistently going on every hand through the second half of the session. But the gentleman on my right had stood up as cards were coming out, and he decided to sit out and did not put a straddle in. I opened to $40 with ace of hearts, 10 of spades, which would be my sizing if there was a $10 straddle. It folds around to the reg in the big blind, and he makes the call. Although my sizing is a little bit on the larger size here, I don't know how much it really will change his calling range here. The pot is $85, and we go to a flop of 8 of spades, 3 of clubs, 2 of clubs. I think that this board is going to be a pretty high frequency check for me. Although I do have a nut advantage with all of my over pairs, it is somewhat diminished as I do not have hands like pocket threes, pocket deuces, or any 2-pair combos. I think that overall this type of board is going to hit the big blinds range quite a bit harder than mine. I have a lot of overcards here, which although may be ahead and have okay equity, are not doing very well compared to my opponent's range, which contains a lot of the suited connected cards. Overall, on this type of board, I'm going to have a very high frequency check, and if I do decide to continue, I'm going to be using a larger size. With a hand like ace 10, especially without a backdoor flush, I think that I have a pretty pure check as my hand has showdown value. So I do elect to check behind. The turn is the ace of clubs. I would expect my opponent to be pro betting here at some frequency with very large sizes, essentially with hands that are 2-pair plus, and most of their bluffs would be hands like straight draws and flush draws. I think overall the ace is going to be better for my range as a lot of my hands become strong top pairs. I also think that I have a lot of flushes here as I'm betting the flop at a very low frequency. The big blind does elect to check, which often means that he has air or medium strength hands. I think versus that range of hands, my hand can definitely bet. I would prefer to probably have a club here, but I don't think that it matters too much. I think that against this opponent, I would expect him to bluff river at a higher frequency than most players, and I think that my ace-10 protects my calling range on the river. I'm also not sure how much value I exactly get when I bet here on the turn, as when it goes check check and then my opponent checks on the turn, I think that they have a lot of air in their range. Even facing a bet, I would not expect my opponent to be continuing with a single weaker club. I also think that my hand specifically is fine to pot control here, as facing a raise would be pretty unfortunate for my specific combo. So I elect to check behind. The river is the ace of diamonds and my opponent checks. I think at this point that I almost always have the strongest hand. I would have expected my opponent to make an aggressive action with any of their straights, flushes, and full house combos at this point. I think that my opponent could still have some weaker ace-x combos, but I expect most of their range to be 8x or pocket pairs that have showdown value, all of which my ace-10 is ahead of, and if they have air, then they have air. So when it checks to me, I think I have a pretty clear value bet here, and I bet $65 into 85. Unfortunately, the aggressive regular raises it up to 265. Pretty unfortunate spot for my hand. I've definitely improved quite a bit by the turn and the river. I think that a lot of my stronger ace-x hands and my ace-x hands with a club would have previously put a bet in on the turn. So I think that I'm relatively high up in my range. I think that when we play the hand passively like this all the way to the river, that there's a slight chance that my opponent has a worse ace-x that they're raising for value, as I did check the turn. Again, I expect my opponent to mostly be betting their straight and flush combos on the turn, especially with their aggressive image. So I think it's hard for them to have too many value hands here, but at the same time, I do think that they are a strong player and they are going to be trapping here at some frequency with full houses, flushes, and straights. Ultimately, after thinking for a little bit and knowing my opponent is capable of bluffing here, as well as possibly having slightly worse value, I think that I have to make the call here, and I do make the call. Unfortunately, my opponent shows me the 5 of clubs, 4 of spades, or the turned straight draw with the straight flush draw, and they get maximum value versus my runner-runner trips. We finish up this session up $2,200, ending the month of September on a very positive note. As always, I appreciate you guys tuning in. I'll see you next week.